here. Subscribe so you never miss an upload.
Welcome to Dungeon Craft. I'm Professor Dungeon Master, and this channel is about running the ultimate game of D&D and other tabletop role-playing games. And to run the ultimate game, you need to be informed as to where the hobby is going. And this is a quick follow-up video to a video I did earlier in the week. I revealed Wizards sales figures for Dungeons & Dragons, and today we're going to be talking about the conference call that they recently had, which I missed and couldn't report on because I was at Gen Con. And this conference call was critical because it confirms what I've been saying on this channel for about 2 years. Dungeons & Dragons is going digital. Let's take a look at the transcript. This is from the transcript provided by Motley Fool. Fred Reitman says, "Hey guys, I just want to come back to Wizards. And if we think back to the Investor Day last fall, I totally recognize a lot of this change, but I felt like D&D was a big piece of the plan to double Wizards' business. And if we just think about the film impairment and the softer box office, does that put those targets at risk, or is there enough traction and momentum in some other areas to offset that?" They're talking about the $25 million write-off Hasbro is taking on that Dungeons & Dragons film. The very weekend after the film debuted, I analyzed the box office, and I called it back then that the film had brought in far less than they were anticipating. I got a lot of crap for that, for people that like the movie or thought I was jumping the gun, but in fact, they've actually revised the opening box office figures for that weekend, and they came in lower than they were initially reported. And the idea was the Dungeons & Dragons film would be enjoyed by tons of kids like the Super Mario Brothers film was, and those kids would come into the D&D ecosphere, and that didn't happen. Chris Cox, the Chief Executive Officer of Hasbro, replied, "Good morning, Fred. I would say the underlying thesis of our D&D business was all about digital. To me, entertainment's a kicker." And I take him at face value. Yes, it was always about digital. The D&D movie was always just icing on the cake. Cox goes on to say it helps to enable broader audiences exposure to what's traditionally a mid-core to hardcore gaming brand. What digital allows us to do is take that kind of tabletop game that we have in the world, which is probably about 80 million people who participate in these hobbies and frequent that kind of channel, and take our brand like D&D to 800 million people who play role-playing games. Put a pin in that. That's important. And so I think Baldur's Gate 3 is just the first of several new digital initiatives you're going to see from us that span how we can try to transform tabletop role-playing gaming into an even richer kind of theater of the mind experience to more traditional video games from us and partners like Larian. Translation: when he says mid-core to hardcore gaming brand, that means the die-hards who still play around a table and who go to conventions to play Dungeons & Dragons and other tabletop role-playing games. What's interesting here is his claim that 800 million people play role-playing games. That is not true, at least depending on how you define role-playing games. To me, role-playing games are played around a table. I know in recent years we've come to distinguish TTRPGs from RPGs, but my thesis would be an RPG, a video game, is not and has never been a role-playing game. Back in the day, the long past days of 1980, a role-playing game, an RPG, was a tabletop role-playing game. There was no other kind. The idea that there are TTRPGs and they are different than RPGs, that language was invented in the last 20 years to distinguish video games from sitting around a table games. But it would be my contention that video games are not role-playing games. They're fundamentally different. My son Michael plays Elder Scrolls and Skyrim, and when I talk to him about his characters, he talks about, I've got a Khajiit. It's a dual-wielding cat person. That's how he sees the character. There is no doing funny voices with your friends or creating a shared experience, even if it's a multiplayer. You are playing the game as it is envisioned by the creator with the limitations of that game. The game does not last forever. Eventually you have to buy a new video game as opposed to a role-playing game which has a dungeon master and can conceivably go on forever. And that is Hasbro's worst nightmare, the idea that you can buy a book, the first edition of Dungeons & Dragons, and still be playing it and have spent no more money. A multinational corporation does not want to hear that. They want to have continuing revenue. For me, a role-playing game requires people to be sitting around a table, even if it's virtual. You have to have a dungeon master, and they create characters. I hate the term build characters because inevitably it ends up with those characters defined by their species and their class and their skins and what kind of weapons they have. That is not a character. I play role-playing games for a totally different reason. They are super immersive. They are theater of the mind. Unlike what Chris Cox is saying, his idea of theater of the mind, I don't know what it is. It's like the opposite of my idea of theater of the mind. But it's the idea that you and your friends will create these characters and manifest those characters, be it through funny voices or a personality that is fundamentally different than your own. And you and the game master and these other players will create an original story that only you could create together. That is the fundamental essence of a role-playing game. To me, it could be totally different to you. I have friends who prefer to play Diablo. They prefer to play Baldur's Gate, where you press a button, it rolls the dice for you. I have friends that actually have told me that. Well, I like fighting the monsters, but I don't want to do funny voices. It makes me feel weird. Not that you have to do funny voices when you play a role-playing game. You don't. But the whole idea of taking on that persona of the character it makes some people feel awkward, and they just prefer the video game. And that's why the video games are more accessible. Also, in addition to that, you don't have to get a bunch of people together necessarily at the same time, allowing you to play the game at your convenience. And that is exactly how Wizards of the Coast and Hasbro sees role-playing games. They think that Baldur's Gate, with its rolling the dice, and it is cool, by the way, you don't just press a button and swing a sword. It rolls the dice for you, and it adds your strength and proficiency bonus. And yes, you can have an amorous encounter with a bear, and for some people, that's good enough. Even a multiplayer experience, you're really just playing with your friends, and that character is more or less an avatar of you. If you want to imagine the character has a background and a personality, that's kind of happening in your own head, and you're not necessarily sharing and acting out with the other people. And again, that's one of the differences between a role-playing game and a video game. Gary Allen Fine was the first sociologist that studied the subcultures of role-playing. And even at the earliest stages of role-playing games, the 70s and 80s, when Fine was studying them, he noticed that different groups of role players play the game a different way. You had people who were into role assumption, which is to say the character is more or less an avatar for the person. And then you have the role players who actually act out the character, and it is a persona that is very different from their own. And that's kind of the lanes in which I see them. And I think that video games, for the people that like role assumption, that see the character as an avatar, video games can be more satisfying, and they're certainly more accessible. Whereas for people that role play, sitting around the table with your friends cannot be replaced. Baldur's Gate, with the rolling of the dice and incorporating actual D&D mechanics into the game, represents for Wizards a new step in what they perceive to be the evolution of role-playing games, as does the VTT. That VTT is where they're focusing. You don't hire Microsoft executives like Chris Cox and Cynthia Williams if you want to run a pen and paper role-playing game with a bunch of books. The books are gradually going to be phased out in favor of a D&D that you can play on your phone. And that's all well and good for a large chunk of the audience. That is going to be what they want. But if you want pen and paper role-playing games with friends around a table, I'm afraid you're going to have to look elsewhere, like Paizo, Dungeon Crawl Classics, Goodman Games, Shadow Dark. There are tons of role-playing games out there, that are role-playing games and not digital experiences. And that's where I'm going to be turning my attention in the upcoming months. Now, if you find this is an interesting topic, you might want to look for my video with Baron DeRopp of Dungeon Masterpiece, where we talk about how long before we're going to have AI DMs. This upcoming week, I'm going to go back to the Caves of Chaos and talk about the true story of Trader Joe. So if you like the minis and the models, more of that coming up, more crafting and painting coming up. And if you like to support my work, you can check out my links to Patreon and my own game, Deathbringer, at the links below. I'll see you soon. May all your rolls be 20s. Deathbringer, why so glum?
I went to Gen Con, but I didn't meet Ginny D.
Oh, that's too bad. I did.
Son of a...
Well, you were busy playing Twilight Imperium, and I didn't want to interrupt you.
Don't go anywhere. I want to have a word with you. And while I do, click on these videos and watch more Dungeon Craft.